Welcome to today's Explainer. We've got a really fascinating trifecta of source materials to unpack today that break down the absolute core pillars of Islam. We're going to objectively explore the historical, textual, and practical foundations of this faith, looking at them exactly as they're presented in our sources. Now, it's a massive subject for sure, but we've structured it visually to make it all incredibly clear. All right, let's dive right in. To make sense of all these texts, we're going to use a straightforward three-part framework. First, we'll look at the messenger. Second, the message. And finally, the mandate. Kicking things off with part 1, the messenger, focusing on history and character. Our sources anchor this historical look squarely on the Battle of Badr in 624 CE. The sources really emphasize a dramatic numerical disadvantage on this critical day. Picture this setup. The Quraysh army approached with 950 well-equipped men, while the Muslim army consisted of only 313 men with extremely limited resources. In fact, the text specifically notes they had just 2 horses and 70 camels among the whole group. The sources frame this as the ultimate underdog victory, asserting that this success was fueled by absolute faith, divine intervention, and unseen angels supporting the completely outmatched believers. But beyond the actual mechanics of the battlefield, the sources paint a really fascinating picture. They describe a leader with, quote, unmatched balance. The text portrays this dual nature. On one hand, a figure who was a fierce, courageous warrior fighting right there at the front lines. But on the other hand, someone deeply committed to seeking advice from his companions. This is a practice known as shura, or consultation. He didn't just blindly give orders, he actively listened to strategic advice, like the decision to move his army to a much better tactical position near the waterwells. These specific traits build a multifaceted profile of leadership and resilience. The sources report he fought at the front lines, yet showed incredibly progressive mercy to captives. For example, he actually offered prisoners of war their freedom if they could teach 10 children in Medina how to read and write. That's a huge deal for that era. The texts also heavily emphasize his emotional endurance. They note he lived through the agonizing pain of burying 6 of his 7 children, yet he consistently chose to forgive his bitterest enemies rather than seeking revenge. Actually, there's a specific quote that really captures this emotional reliance on faith. According to the source, despite immense personal tragedies and the incredibly heavy burdens of leadership, he maintained a profound spiritual composure. He's quoted in the text as saying, "I only complain of my sorrow and grief to Allah." It's a portrait of deep endurance that the sources say set the absolute standard for any believer facing hardship. But a messenger is really only as enduring as the message they carry. So how exactly do the sources say the foundational text of this faith was constructed and preserved through the centuries? Let's move to our next section and see how this builds. Section 2, the message, the Quran. We are now shifting gears from the battlefields to the origins, the compilation, and some of the specific miraculous claims made about the central text in our sources. This timeline maps out the textual journey detailed in the sources. It all begins in 610 CE with the very first command of Iqra, meaning read, delivered by the angel Gabriel in the cave of Hira. Now, rather than arriving as a massive, complete book all at once, the text was revealed gradually over a period of 23 years. And the sources argue there's deep wisdom in this, as verses arrive to address the specific, unfolding needs of the community at that exact time. Finally, in the post-prophet era, leaders like the caliphs Abu Bakr and Uthman led a highly rigorous process to officially compile the text. They cross-referenced it with people who had memorized it word for word, standardizing the written version to ensure its exact preservation. The sources also highlight that this text introduced some radically progressive social rules for the 7th century. We are talking about sweeping decrees that totally disrupted the existing social order. It instituted women's rights to inheritance, humane treatment of animals. It even went as far as mandating that camels shouldn't be overloaded. Plus, it declared absolute equality regardless of social status, wealth, or skin color. The texts describe these reforms as utterly extraordinary for that time in history. Now consider this specific number, 2,806. The sources claim that the word Allah appears exactly this many times in the Quran. But they go much, much further than a simple word count. They introduce a concept called tawafuk. In the text, this is described as a miraculous mathematical and visual alignment. Basically, the sources claim that across different pages, words like Allah perfectly line up on the physical page, literally one under the other or symmetrically back to back. And this is despite the verses having been revealed years apart and being of totally varying lengths. It's like a giant puzzle perfectly slotting together. Alongside the literary claims, the sources present arguments for what they call scientific miracles, contrasting standard 7th century knowledge with interpretations of Quranic verses. While folks in the 7th century largely believed the sky was a fixed, solid dome, the sources point to verses describing the sky as a protected roof and the universe as an expanding entity. They argue this perfectly foretells modern discoveries like the ozone layer and the expanding universe established by modern cosmology. There's another really fascinating comparison from the texts, and this one's about iron. Historically, people just assumed iron was formed naturally inside the earth, but the sources highlight a verse stating iron was actually sent down, which they strongly align with modern astrophysics. Because today, science tells us that heavy elements like iron actually form in the cores of exploding stars, or supernovae, and were brought to early Earth via meteorites. Pretty wild, right? And the sources take a very similar approach with human biology. The text breaks down embryonic development into highly specific stages. Nutfa, meaning a drop, alaka, a clinging clot, and mudja, a chewed-like lump of flesh. The sources argue this sequence flawlessly mirrors modern embryology, detailing specific anatomical stages that were literally impossible to observe centuries before the invention of the microscope. Okay, so we've seen the grand historical narrative of the messenger and the extensive literary and scientific claims made about the text. But so what? What you should really take away from this is how all of this grand history funnels down to the individual. How did this history and this text actually shape the practical day-to-day life of a believer? That takes us into our third and final section, the mandate, looking at prayer and accountability. To really understand this, we're drawing on a powerful source sermon that details the intense spiritual weight of daily religious practice. The sermon draws a really sharp contrast between what it calls worldly death and spiritual death. While the modern world gets completely caught up in hospitals, ICU beds, and medical machinery, worrying entirely about the physical failing of the body, the source insists the true reality of death is entirely spiritual. It describes a vivid, intense transition involving the immediate presence of angels, strict questioning in the grave, and absolute accountability before the Creator regarding exactly how one spent their life. To really highlight the stakes of this transition, the text urges believers not just to mourn physically, but to act spiritually at the moment of a loved one's passing. It instructs, quote, read Surah Yasin to the dying. What if their weak faith is strengthened at the last moment? It's this extreme, intense focus on preserving a person's faith right up until their final breath, ensuring they cross over with spiritual strength. And what is the absolute core of that faith and practice? Well, according to the sources, all the history of the messenger and all the complex scripture of the message culminate in one uncompromising mandate: namaz, the daily prayer. 5. That is the exact number of mandatory daily prayers. And the source sermon is incredibly strict on this point. It warns that neglecting these 5 prayers isn't just some minor slip in your routine. It actively brings worldly misery. The text even shares this intense analogy of a person sleeping through prayer, claiming that the heat of hellfire is literally burning beneath their very bed. The theological consequences listed in the sources for missing these 5 daily connections are incredibly severe. Synthesizing these strict instructions, the text insists believers must absolutely never sleep past the dawn prayer, emphasizing that it sets the entire spiritual tone for the day. It argues that prayer, not just your job or your business, is the true source of a person's daily sustenance. The sermon reports that neglecting prayer removes all peace and blessings from a household, basically guaranteeing family strife and misfortune. And finally, the sources state unequivocally that prayer will be the very first thing a person is questioned about on the Day of Judgment, no exceptions. Ultimately, the text outlines a unique final reward for those who uphold this mandate. The sources mention the theological belief that in the afterlife, believers won't be recognized by their worldly clothes, their social status, or their wealth. Instead, they'll be recognized by the glowing marks of their ablution and prostration. The physical act of submitting in prayer, of literally touching the head to the ground, is what marks them for salvation in the eyes of their Creator. So we've unpacked the history of the messenger, the recorded textual miracles of the message, and the strict daily mandate expected of believers, all exactly as detailed in our sources. With history, text, and daily practice so deeply intertwined, how does this framework reshape your understanding of Islamic devotion? It's an immense amount of material to process, and it certainly invites a lot of deeper exploration into how these texts continue to influence billions of lives today. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.